Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Seminar Committee, Department of History, University of Delhi, I welcome you to a webinar with Professor Partho Datta. Professor Partho Datta teaches at the School of Art and Aesthetics in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has previously taught in the Department of History, Zakir Hussain Evening College, University of Delhi. Professor Datta is an alumnus of our department and has done his doctoral research from Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. He has published on colonial planning, including a book, Planning the City, Urbanization and Reform in Kolkata, 1800 to 1940. He has also co-edited a volume on cities with Professor Narayani Gupta. Professor Datta has been a fellow of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. At JNU, he offers courses on the history of Khayal and an advanced course on classical traditions in music across cultures. Today, he will be speaking on approaches to the history of music and Khayal. We are very pleased to host his talk here today, and we also welcome and request Professor Amar Farooqi to chair the talk. Over to you, sir.
Should I start speaking or will Amar be
Sir,
talking?
I think Amar sir hasn't
Razi,
been able
sir.
to join yet.
Okay, fine. So should
Yeah,
I just
so-
begin or should we wait?
No, please begin.
Okay,
He will
fine.
join us.
Fine, yeah. So Srijani, thank you so much for that very warm welcome, and thank you, Razi, for inviting me. I can't tell you how delighted I am to actually speak to the history department. You rightly said I'm an alumnus, and let me tell you that all my training in history has been in this department. I've been an MA student and MPhil student, and I remember with great gratitude the wonderful teachers I had. Really, I must mention them: the late Professor Partho Gupta and Professor Aparna Basu, and also my teacher, Professor Shumit Sarkar. I mean, I still remember their inspiring lectures. And Professor Partho Gupta was also very interested in music. He also wrote on music and history. So that was one point of inspiration for me. So thank you once again. Now, let me tell you a little bit, introduce my presentation today. So, which is that all my life I have taught history, undergraduate history actually, most of my life. And now I teach music history in Jawaharlal Nehru University. So there are some interesting issues that have come up, which I really want to share with you. So I straddle two worlds now. And they're not particularly profound issues or anything, but I think they're worth sharing. So that's the first part of my paper, which is really, which says that approaches to music and approaches to Khayal, right? The second part of my paper, I will actually deal more specifically with Khayal histories, and I'll tell you about this a little more. A little bit about why I called my paper a survey. I think I should just make it clear, because I will be talking about histories of Khayal which were written in the past by historians and music scholars. I will also be drawing on a range of very interesting recent work which has happened. Say, by recent, I mean in the last couple of decades or so. There's no time to go into the details of these scholars, but in the question answer, I'm very happy to answer some of these questions. And of course, I'm going to offer my own narrative of Khayal. That'll come right more towards the end of this paper. I have also looked at some material, and I would like to offer this to you. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction. Now, let me tell you that Khayal history is actually full of paradoxes. This is, and I hope that you will be able to see it as I keep on telling you about it. And the thing is this, that one of the arguments that I will be making in the second part of my paper, when I actually deal with Khayal, is that Khayal, I argue that Khayal dominates. Now, we will talk about this a bit because, of course, people have written about the spread of Khayal, the proliferation of Khayal, but I like to use the word domination because I think that sometimes if one shift registers, then it gives us a new insight. One can ask new kinds of questions. So that's how I've actually pitched this paper. Now, as I hope there is some time in the end, I will also be dealing with the relationship between Khayal and audio recordings. That is the recordings that were made of Khayal which began in the early 20th century. Right? People have also written about this, but I have something to offer here, and I make a kind of argument about it, which I will also be talking about. There's something else I will also be hinting at throughout the paper, and I will make more clear, which is that, and this is a division that I have made, which is, I think, there is a long history of Khayal and there is a short history of Khayal. What do I mean by this? That will become a little more clear when I sort of read my paper. But I do want to tell you that this kind of division that I have made is not arbitrary. It's not just descriptive or anything. It's based on two kinds of things. One is the kind of sources we use. I'm aware that I'm speaking in the history department, so these are very important, the kind of sources we use to study Khayal. And also, of course, related to the sources, the kind of methodology. What kind of methods do we use? That, I think, can make a division between short histories and long histories. Okay. Now, I want to ramble a bit about approaches to music. Of course, this is related to how we approach Khayal histories also, the history of Khayal. According to me, again, there are two kinds of histories. One is histories of music, and the other is social histories of music. And I distinguish these two. And here there is a paradox. And what is the paradox? The paradox is that the more music becomes social, the less it is about music. In fact, music leaches out of it. This is very, very interesting. So people study the context of music, they study the social and political, environment in which music is produced and appreciated. But in the end, very little comes out about the music itself, right? This is something that has to be noted, right? In fact, music scholars have long worried about this. So, for instance, people will talk about histories of music without music, right? Can such a thing be there actually? But yes, it actually can happen. There's a very famous American music scholar and musicologist called Caroline Abbott. She even talks about musicology without music. Right. So so what I'm trying to tell you is that music scholars have to confront this all the time. That the more you do the social history of music, somehow music, quote unquote music, somehow gets left out. Okay, let's think about this a little more. I mean, what do social historians of music usually address? What do they do really when they study the context, social and political context, let us say? Usually, I say, not always, there are many, many things that can be studied, but usually they study, let us say, the relationship of music with the state, right? This would obviously interest historians, that's what I'm telling you. And why do they study this relationship between the music and the state? Because it tells us about censorship, and it tells us something about how music is regulated. It's a fascinating history, actually. And let me tell you, I know that poor Aurangzeb gets a very bad press because he's supposed to have banned music. But this tradition of banning music goes back a long, long time ago, 2000 years ago. In fact, Plato, the great Plato, in his Republic, talks about banning music. He says the best way to control people is to ban their music, because music is really exemplifies the nature of the people. right? So it's a long, long history. It's very, very interesting. Other things that social historians of music are likely to study is patronage. This is very important in the history of the arts, of course, as you know, even in the history of painting and so on and so forth. And why do we study patronage, really? I mean, one of them is because it tells us something about status. And of course, it tells us about aspirations. It's very, 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 very important. So that is, I'm just roughly telling you that this is something what the social historians of music are likely to study, right? So what do music historians study? I remember I told you I've made two distinctions. Usually, music historians study a genre, right? They will study the history of Khayal, for instance, or the history of Ghazal, or the history of Thumri, or in Western classical music, they will study the history of sonata, or the history of the symphony, and so on and so forth. They study genre, they study the form, they study aesthetics, they study the dynamics and momentum of music, right? And that is what they really invest in. What happens is when music historians and social historians of music don't often see eye to eye. They don't see eye to eye. And one of the problems is, so for instance, and this I find very amusing because I myself was, have taught history for years and years. You take open any textbook of on history, for instance, you'll never find a mention of music there, right? Architecture, perhaps. And we know why architecture is reluctantly let in, because our monumental architecture has some connections with state formations, right? But music never figures there. We know why. In the theories of history, music doesn't matter. So you can see that the music historians are pretty annoyed about this. On the other hand, the social historians of music accuse the historians of music of other kinds of illusions, or silences. So for instance, they will ask, you study music, where is caste? Where is class? Where is gender? You don't even study it. It's almost as if music is always in a vacuum, right? And there is no, so there is a kind of face-off. It's very obvious and you can see it happening. I'm not saying that either of the histories is not valid. There are very valid ways to write the histories of music. But they somehow don't seem to meet. There is no meeting ground here. Now, how do we work this out? What do we do? I mean, obviously people have been thinking about it, as I said. And one is, I will read out a quote to you, just to show this kind of face-off that is there. And this is a quote which I just love because it's by a music historian. And it actually exemplifies the kind of frustration because these two streams are not meeting. And this is again by an American music critic and also a music historian, very, very famous, called Alex Ross. And he says, let me quote to you. He says, if history cannot tell us anything about music, music can tell us something about history. Right? I'm going to repeat this again. If history cannot tell us anything about music, music can tell us something about history. But how? That's the question. That's really the big question. Okay, so what can be done? How have people thought about this? I think we really need to understand it. One is that historians have to learn music. Simple. I mean, this is a formidable technical requirement, and it's very necessary. It's very necessary. It's like learning a language. You have to. I mean, although whether music is a language or not, I don't know. But I mean, there are lots of debates about that. But it's something that needs to be learned. Why do we need to learn this? Because simply because if you learn music or if you learn to listen to it, that is also a kind of learning. Then maybe newer kinds of questions can be asked. And that I hope to demonstrate in my paper, which I will be reading after this. So secondly, we have to work on integrative theories. That is, theories which integrate music and history, right? Now, historians themselves are not unfamiliar with this kind of exercise, right? I mean, why are they not? I mean, you know this because, I mean, I've been through this myself, that historians are debating all the time, you know, what is the relationship between the superstructure and the base, between culture and society, between ideology and materiality. So therefore, we can also say, let's have a theory about music and society. And many music scholars have actually worked on this. I can't tell you about everyone, but I would like to mention three people. Three people whose works I'm particularly I like very much. One is actually a scholar, very, very well-known scholar, international star. All of you know about it. He passed away some years ago, Edward Said. Edward Said, Edward Said of Orientalism. I don't know how many of you know, but Edward Said was a trained pianist, and he also wrote books on music, right? And he grappled with these issues, and he offered a kind of theory. And his theory, I won't go into this, maybe at question hour, we can, if somebody is interested. He used the theory, what he called transgression. And let me explain to you what transgression is, what he meant by it. Transgression is not just breaching of boundaries. By that he meant, he actually says it himself, I'm just quoting him. He says, by transgression, I mean that music makes itself at home in spaces where you least expect to find it. In other words, you should look for music everywhere. That is what he meant by transgression. That was one theory he offered. The person that Said himself was in constant scholarly debate with was another great philosopher and thinker who also thought along these lines. That is the German thinker and philosopher Theodore Adorno. Now, Adorno is very difficult to read. There are lots of commentaries on him, and Said himself has written on Adorno. Adorno had a theory about German music. As all of you know, that the 18th and 19th century German composers, the famous, Mozart, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, very, very important part in the canon, in the Western classical canon, and then the whole history of German composition and music. What is the relationship between that music and the trends in German politics? And by trends in German politics, of course, Adorno meant that the trends towards authoritarianism and finally the Nazi state. Can a link be actually made? He offered a theory about it, So again, link between society and music. The third person who has done extensive work on this, and it's very, very accessible, is an American, a celebrated American music scholar and historian called Richard Taruskin. He has written the multi-volume Oxford History of Western Classical Music. It's very easily available on the net. It's available in libraries, very big tomes, many, many volumes. And they are wonderful integrative studies. Particularly, I found the 19th century volumes of 19th century and early 20th century very, very important, because they offer a theory about how music modernized and how it confronted modernity. So that is very well done, with theories of society which were emerging in Euro-America at this time, how we can see a connection with Western classical music there. What was really happening? If you read it, it's very, very rich history, very wonderful history. So that is the history of integrative theories, through which we work out this gap between music and history, which I was telling you about. Now, I want to tell you one more thing. I remember what this kind of impatience of Alex Ross, where he said that, historians don't tell us anything about music. Music will tell us something about history. Some of this impatience is because the social historians of music, not all of them, but some of them don't seem to engage with the disciplines that have emerged from music studies itself. I mean, I don't know of many historians, and there are very important disciplines which have emerged. I don't know, frankly, I don't know many historians who engage with, for instance, musicology, or they engage with ethnomusicology. That's also very, very important disciplinary stream. And then there is, in the last 20, 30 years, another very important discipline which has emerged, which is called sound studies. And they offer a way to theorize about music and society. So I think we really need to engage with that also. We really need to. Well, some people do, but not everyone, right? Okay. Now I want to briefly, and I'm going to end this section on the first section of my paper with this, that we really need to think about the nature of music also. That is, what I'm emphasizing is that music is not just another subject for historians. It can't be. We have to, and this all historians anyway do it. I'm just saying this. I hope this doesn't sound simplistic, but the fact is that if you're studying a subject, you need to understand the nature of the subject. I'd like to say this, that again, to go back to historians of music and social historians of music, this difference I was making, usually historians of the social historians have a theory of society, which they work out through history, right? And the history may be the history of music or history of anything that they are studying. Music historians usually argue that music itself has something to say. It is offering something. It has something to say. And the job of the music scholar is to try and find out what this music is really saying. That is, it's a tough thing to say. So that is what really takes me to the last part, very short. And again, if you want to know a little more, because these are very complex areas about the nature of music. Why is it a complex area? Even frankly, if you ask me, even I fear to tread on this ground, because it takes you into philosophy, into epistemology, and it takes you into social anthropology. Social anthropology, because many musical cultures in the world are oral cultures. Now, so just to indicate some problems and the way we understand the nature of music, let me just indicate to you. I'm indicating those things which may be, for which historians themselves would immediately feel some kind of affinity. So, for instance, one thing about music is temporality, which is that music happens through time, right? It begins, you start listening to something and then it ends. There is some time. Time has elapsed. Historians also deal with time. But the question is musical time and historical time the same? That is a very, very big question. There's so much debate on this, right? So we have to be aware of what's happening there. Let me tell you about something else, which is about the production of knowledges, which is happening in music, right? What kind of knowledge does music produce? Again, this is a very tricky subject because let me tell you that Indic theories of sound and music, that is Indian civilization, the kind of theories it has produced about its own music, they are not anthropocentric. In fact, they all have theories of primal sound. So in some senses, music exists before human beings. We have to grapple with that also. Let me just give you a quick example. All the great religions, South Asian religions, have a notion of primal sound, right? So you have Om in Hinduism, you have Hu in Sufism, Allahu, Allahu, which is reiterated again and again. You have the Shabad in the Sikh tradition, and so on and so forth. So I hope you get a sense of this. Not only is the theories of sound and music not anthropocentric, you can see what problems it creates for historians. Sort of knowledges that are produced, they are collective. They're not individualized. So, for instance, who made Rag Marwa? Who made Rag Bhairavi? We don't know. We just don't know. Right? There is no authorship. It's not even an important question in this tradition. Right? So these are things which one has to grapple with. Historians have to grapple with. Otherwise, we won't be able to understand. As I said, that if we are really to write the histories of music, then we have to understand the nature of music also. Right? So there are many more questions. There are many more sort of questions we can ask of this, but I'll just stop here. So I've indicated what are the problems when you actually start writing the histories of music. It can't be just that you do a social history of music, you contextualize music, then you may actually miss out on many questions that emerge from the body of music itself. That's what I was trying to tell you. Okay, so that more or less finishes the first part of my presentation. Now I want to really address Khayal, which is what I work on and what many other, some very brilliant scholars have worked on also. Tell you a bit about the historiography, tell you about the trends of history writing, and the narratives that have been made. Really, that is the most interesting thing about the history of Khayal. And I will also bring in music, which is what I'll try to do, you know. Now, before I begin, I hope I'm not being presumptuous. I do want to just tell you what Khayal is. I'm sure all of you know it anyway, but let me just tell you. I'll just read this out. So just the very basic points about the genre of Khayal. So Khayal is a genre of vocal music based on ragas. There is some consensus that it came into its own in the 18th century. Some say that the history of Khayal is much older, right? The second thing is that it has always been associated with institutions. This music has always been associated with institutions, with courts, with dargahs, with mathas, very important. And the link with status has been very strong. So the patrons of this music have been monarchs, landlords, merchants, the bourgeoisie, and aspiring middle classes. Right? There's one more thing I want to tell you about this. If you look at histories of music, and particularly about Khayal, that there is a consensus that this kind of music, that Khayal music, is thoughtful, it's reflective, and it's elevated, right? And this is very important, that this music needs initiation, and the appreciation is never uninformed. I repeat, the appreciation is never uninformed. You have to know, you have to be a connoisseur of listening. And of course, you can be a musician. Only then you can appreciate it, right? So the appreciation is never uninformed. This distinguishes it from other kinds of music. That's why I'm making this point. This is not to say, and I'm saying this immediately because people will immediately ask this question, that popular music is not thoughtful or it does not have thinking behind it, right? But the idea about this kind of music is that it fulfills more than a merely functional role. That is what actually distinguishes this kind of music. We may agree with this or we may not agree with this, but that's how this music presents itself. This is its kind of identity. There's one more thing I want to flag, because I'm not going to go into that in detail, but I want you to, and I'm sure all of you know about it already, but it's very important to flag it, which is Khayal today is stamped with a strong urban middle class ethos. And the performers come from this class. But its history shows that this music was generated and sustained by Muslim ustads and women singers called baijis. These were professional singing communities, and this is what I want to stress, whose status in society was always marginal. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to, very brief, a kind of potted introduction to Khayal. We'll have to just flag it and keep it aside. Now I'll tell you a little more. Now, I remember I told you that I was going to explore two themes. One is, why is Khayal dominant? And what do I mean by this? I'll just explain to you. And the second is that the history of recording and Khayal, if there is time, that is. I mean, I'll have to look at the clock and then I'll see. Okay, now what I wanted to tell you is that there are two ways to look at this, the dominance of Khayal, right? One is that when we talk about Khayal today, how do we think about it really? So there are the terms that we used interchangeably with Khayal is Hindustani music and classical music, right? And also raga music. These have become interchangeable. So when we think about Khayal, we seem to be talking about all these terms, right? How come this has happened? Because if you look at the history of these categories separately, all raga music is not Khayal, right? I mean, we know that Hindi film music is also based on ragas, but we don't call it Khayal, right? How come somehow we seem to think that it is Khayal which is the raga music? This is very interesting. This is what I mean when I talk about the dominance of Khayal. Let's look at a couple of other such categories. Say, let's look at Hindustani music. Very interesting. Why do we call Khayal Hindustani music? We need to ask this question. How did it come to be? The history is very interesting. In the 1870s, a very important anthology was published by a Bengali musicologist called S.M. Tagore, and the name of the anthology was Hindu Music. It was published in English, right? I don't even want to go into the history of that, but later if there is time. In the early 20th century, another very famous musicologist, much revered now, whose name you must have heard, Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande, early in the 20th century, publishes his treatise on Indian music. It's a multi-volume treatise. It's called Hindustani Sangeet Paddhati, the system of Hindustani music. The question then arises, how did Hindu music become Hindustani? We really have to ask this question, right? Thirdly, let's look at the category of classical. When we use the term classical, what do we mean by this? How has Khayal become classical? Again, we need to ask this question. And let me tell you that the Indian term for classical, or the Hindi term for classical, is Shastriya, which means from the Shastras. Literally, it means that. You'll be surprised to know that the term classical in Western classical music, it's come from the West, by the way, this term classical, has nothing to do with Shastras. So why have we pitched it to the Shastras? That is very interesting, right? We need to really think about these things. So what I'm trying to say, and I want to flag this right in the beginning, it's not enough to do the history of music. We also have to do the history of categories through which we study this music. That is what I think is very, very important to doing this kind of music history. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the uneven history of domination. The uneven history of domination. And before I do that, I want to tell you something, that when we think about Khayal today, somehow we have in our mind a certain modular form. Let me just give you an example quickly from contemporary times. Let's take, say, three Khayal singers, three famous Khayal singers. Two of them have passed away a few years ago, but they're celebrated. Say Kishori Amonkar, Jasraj, and let us say the contemporary great maestro Rashid Khan, right? All of them sing Khayal, right? So there is some commonality between them. What is that commonality? So musically, as if you ask musicologists and music scholars, they will tell you there is something, there is a modular form which is common to all of them, musically, which is common to all of them. Let me tell you, and this is so interesting, that this form of Khayal is not old at all. It's barely 50 years old. And the person who, quote unquote, constructed this way of singing Khayal was a very famous maestro called Ustad Amir Khan. He died in 1970. Just to give you a date, a sense. This form of elaborating the raga and presenting the raga, which now we think of as Khayal, was something which is usually agreed by musicians and musicologists that he's the one who actually put it together. There's a long history to it also, but he put it together. So the Khayal we think, please keep this in mind. The Khayal that we think is Khayal is actually contemporary music. So when we do the history, we have to be very careful. The Khayal of the past, is it the same Khayal we are talking about? We really need to investigate that. Okay, now, since I flagged this, let me now go to the next thing, the domination of Khayal. The history of this is, history of the domination of Khayal is extremely uneven. I say this because the assumption is that there was this music, it was very beautiful, and it was quickly accepted. But that's not how it happened at all. The acceptance of this music or its entrenchment was contested, and it happened differently in different areas. So I'll give you two examples. The most famous example is from what we call Maharashtra today. This is where Khayal really has proliferated, right? All the famous important vocalists, like most of them come from this region, right? Now, and I want to quote a wonderful a little nugget from one of the great ustads. This is Ustad Allah Dia Khan. Ustad Allah Dia Khan was the founder of what is called the Jaipur Gharana. And this quote I've taken from the essay of a very well-known music scholar, Urmila Bhetikar. And this is what Allah Dia Khan said. He said, it's very interesting. He said, and this is about Khayal, right? He says, Uttar paida karti hai, Dakkan daad deti hai. Meaning, although this music, that is Khayal, was born in the north, it is really in the Dakkan, actually, Dakkan, that it really got appreciation, right? And actually, it's true. If you just look at the history of Khayal, it really comes into its own in this whole belt, all the way from Gujarat, what we call the Dakkan, Gujarat, that is present-day Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Karnataka. Some of the most famous Khayal singers are actually all from Karnataka. Kumar Gandharv, Mallikarjun Mansur, Bhimsen Joshi, just to give you some, Gangubai Hangal, and so on and so forth, right? So the history of Khayal really is here. It really makes you think, should we really call this Hindustani music? Really? Because this is really the music of the West, if you really think about it. Okay. Now, the proliferation of Khayal in this Dakkan, that is, happened in two ways. And one I'll just very briefly tell you about, because Urmila Bhetikar has written extensively on it, and you can certainly read it, which is that it happened through theater music. The spread of this music of Khayal happened through. It's very interesting. How did this happen? And we know this, again, I'm quickly going over this, that post 1857, with the breakup of the sort of Lahore, Delhi sort of courtly cultures, we know that the ustads who were attached to this court started traveling. This is very important. They started migrating to look for work, obviously. They traveled to the east, they traveled to the west, they started going to the south. The most famous example of this is the principal ustad in Bahadur Shah Zafar's court, an ustad called Ustad Tanras Khan. His name was Mir Kutub Baksh. He actually traveled all the way to Hyderabad and to the Nizam's court, right? So Khayal travels all the way to Hyderabad. So this history is definitely starts happening. And what we know, so the music starts spreading. And from Urmila Bhetikar's essay, we know that the very early pioneers of music theatre in Maharashtra started drawing on the bank of Khayal compositions which these ustads brought with them. And the most famous example here that Urmila Bhetikar gives is this very pioneer sort of Sangeet Natak pioneer called Vishnudas Bhave, who in the 1840s actually said that when he was composing for theatre, he said the music that we get in Maharashtra is not adequate. I need other kinds of music. And he started drawing on Khayal, right? The compositions of Khayal. So that's how Khayal starts sort of spreading. It's very, very important. Okay. Now, the second thing that happened was that there were a range of ustads who traveled and found home in small princely courts, all through Maharashtra particularly. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Again, this is from Urmila Bhetikar's essay. So ustads found homes in Satara, in Kolhapur, Shahu Maharaj, Sangli, Ichalkaranji, Kurundavad, Aund, and so on and so forth. Right. So they found a home there. And they started teaching. What is interesting, and this has connections with the history of Khayal and how the histories got written, is that we know that the people who were learning from these Muslim ustads were primarily Hindu Brahmins. And this has been well documented. So for instance, Janaki Bakhle, in a very important book on Hindustani music, which some of you may know about, actually has a range of names which she has actually won. I can tell you later on. That the first generation of students who learned from the stalwarts of the Gwalior Gharana, like Haddu Hassu Khan, where people like Vasudev Joshi, Balakrishna Bua Ichchal Karanjikar, and Vishnu Digambar Paluskar. And there were many other names. They were all Hindu Brahmins. This is very, very, very interesting. Now, this leads to a very interesting development for the history and the writing of the history of Khayal. So, what happens is that history start getting written a little later, of course, and but more than what they're saying, we have to really look at the discourse that is generated. And the discourse that is generated is that this this group of disciples are the saviors. They become the saviors of this music. That is the discourse. That कि हमने बचा दिया. ये so in Hindi they would say ये लुप्त हो रहा था, ये गाना लुप्त हो रहा था, हमने बचा लिया. And this myth of the illiterate ustad कि ये अगर इनके पास रहता, so this would have gone, we learned it, and we saved it. This is a very interesting development. And then, the implications of this was when the histories of music got written, and of course histories of Khayal also, what happened? A seamless connection was made between Sanskrit texts about music produced in the past and the music of the present, which was now seen as being in the custody of Hindu disciples. This is very, very interesting. So there is that connection has been definitely made, was definitely made. Now, let me tell you, so far what I have told you is conventional history. I mean, we all know this. I mean, elites, all kinds of elites, appropriate popular culture, and then tailor histories to suit their purpose. You know, this is nothing new. I mean, this has happened. It happened in music, it happened elsewhere also. I mean, there's nothing new about it. The interesting thing is that the story actually gets complicated. It's not so simple. So what I'm trying to tell you, and here music scholars have actually made a lot of contribution, which is that if we just pitch it as Hindu-Muslim, Hindu versus Muslim, this takeover of Hindu disciples of the Muslim, so-called Muslim music, then although that was important, certainly we need to document that, we would actually be making it reductive. It was actually much more complex. The story was much more complex. And the complexity of this music happens, and I must tell you the other story, which is another very famous Maharashtrian Brahmin who sets out on a long journey. And his name was Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande. Very, very famous. His agenda is to create a national music. This is a nationalist agenda. So he sets about looking for national music in India. It's absolutely fascinating. He maintained a diary. That diary is apparently somewhere there. There are rumors that it's going to be published someday. Published many books. I told you he published books on the system of Hindustani music, and so on and so forth. And here there is, and this quest for national music is governed by another kind of myth, which is also very, very fascinating. And what is that myth? That myth is that if there is one thing in Indian culture which remains untainted by quote unquote outsiders, then that is our music. Somehow it escapes colonization by outsiders. And here, let me tell you, certainly there is a communal tinge. It is not only British colonizers, but also obviously you can guess the Muslims from the north, right? So Muslim monarchs, obviously. So this notion that our music somehow escapes. So Bhatkande sets about looking for this music. He reaches South India. He's very impressed with the music knowledge there. There is a separate system. It's based on ragas. We call it Carnatic music now. He's very impressed by the scholarship, the long scholarship from the 16th, 17th century around this music. But you will be surprised. He doesn't take to the music. So this so-called South Indian music, which could have been the national music because, well, you know, it is untainted by, somehow manages to be untainted by British rule, but also by North Indian Muslim rule. This is the myth. When he goes there, he is just not, he just doesn't take to it. This is so interesting. What does he take to? He comes back and he adopts Khayal, which is a product of the Islamicate cultures of North India. It's fascinating, absolutely. That's why Hindu music becomes Hindustani music, right? So this transition of Khayal into the national music is riven with contention. There's so much self-doubt. It has to be worked out. And my argument is that one of the reasons why Khayal dominates is because Khayal is adopted as the national music of India. That is why it is present. It is the classical music, right? So that is one argument. Let me tell you a little bit about, very briefly, about what happened elsewhere, just to tell you why this history of domination is completely uneven, which is if you go to Bengal. In Bengal, this history, Khayal does not get a happy reception. There's a wonderful anecdote which has been recorded, by the way, that in the 1870s, very famous Gwalior Ustad called Ustad Haddu Khan travels to Calcutta and he sings Khayal. And people run away from his concert. And then somebody goes up to him and says, Ki, Ustadji, you know, you are singing this genre. People don't know the genre here. Why don't you sing the same music in the older form, older style of music, which is prevalent in North India, which is Dhrupad, and then people will be able to appreciate it. So Haddu Khan sings the Khayal composition in a Dhrupad way, and the next concert is somewhat of a success, right? So Khayal is not immediately accepted. The best example of this actually comes from, if we look at the musical production and the musical work of the great Rabindranath Tagore. Remember, Rabindranath Tagore is writing on music from the 1890s onwards, right? And he's himself a composer. Of course, he does not compose raga music. He's not composing classical music. He writes songs, but he's very influenced by raga music. And in the he does not take to Khayal at all, by the way. If you look at his compositions, the early part of the music, his compositions are very influenced by Dhrupad, which is the older form of raga music. And later on, he just took off on his own musical career. And there is a a very, very interesting a set of letters which he exchanged. This was in the 1930s. It was published in the 1930s by which he exchanged with the sociologist, a very pioneering Indian sociologist called D.P. Mukherjee, Durjati Prasad Mukherjee. And there Tagore actually says, he says, I am not particularly enamored of Ustadi music, by which he means Khayal. He says the reason is that tradition has something to say, but if I adopt that tradition, then what will I have to say? I also want to say something. I want to say something new, right? So he does not connect to this music at all, right? So the history of, and there are many more examples I can tell you, that the history of Khayal in Bengal is one of unwelcome. And Khayal is adopted in Bengal finally. It happens, but happens much later in the 1830s, 1840s onwards, right? So do remember that the domination of Khayal has different kinds of histories. Okay, now let me tell you a little about recording and music. And I'm going to read, because that's another way in which Khayal starts dominating. So let me just find my text just a minute. Yeah. So recording technology was first introduced in India around the late 1890s. First in wax discs, then in shellac, initially mechanical recording, from the 1920s, electrical recording. So discographers have, of course, worked extensively on this subject. And between 1900 and 1950, according to one scholar, Jonathan Ward, who has published something as late, in 2020, you'll be surprised to know, and this is of Indian music, there were 500,000 recordings made. These are, by recordings made, 3.5 minute, 78 RPM discs, 500,000 recordings made, of which there are thousands and thousands are of Khayal. And the people who recorded Khayals were Ustads, courtesans, Baijis, that is, and many others, right? A range of people who were recording at this time. Now, what we get from these recordings, and I'm telling you a little bit about this source, is that we get very little biographical information on these performers, except, of course, for, so we just have the names, except for the very famous stars, like, for instance, about Begum Akhtar, we know a lot, or say Ustad Fayaz Khan, we have biographical information, but we don't really know more about the others, right? So what I want to stress here is that Khayal historians really need to think about the relationship between Khayal and recording a little more. Firstly, usually, and scholars treat this as illustrative material. And the understanding is that this kind of recording is incomplete, right? Because you only have 3.5 minutes to record. And usually the performance of Khayal is longer. So the understanding is that it's incomplete recordings, right? But what has been missed, and this I think is very, very interesting, is that that exactly at the same time that recordings were happening, the entire Khayal tradition was reorganizing itself. This happened at the same time. The oral tradition was reorganizing itself. And this reorganization of this tradition is called what we call the history of the Gharanas. I don't know whether any of you are aware that all the Gharanas date back to the late of Khayal, date back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's that new. I mean, it's just 100, 120 years, 150 years old. So there is a link between, I think I'm positing this link between recording, the spread of recording, oral recordings, and the reorganization of this Gharana tradition. What I want to tell you also is that this is a fascinating source. It's an archive, but this is an archive which is not a state archive. Historians are so used to the archive of the state. This is an archive which is produced by the market, right? So it is, a victim of the vagaries of the market also. So what I'm trying to tell you is that this archive is actually quite incomplete in ways that everything was not recorded. And sometimes political and economic conditions affected what was recorded and what was not. So for instance, the great crash of 1929 led to the crash of markets all over the world. Recordings also stopped, right? As a result, music historians have lost a swathe of possible oral recordings of people who could have been recorded by these private companies who were in the market at this time. So we have to think about that also. Now, what I'm suggesting, a couple of things. And this is very, very interesting. Razi, I have another 10 minutes or so, isn't it?
Yeah, please continue. Please continue.
Okay, fine.
Yes.
Because I noticed it's already become 4:30. So I'm going to wind up now. So the thing is this, that this this archive that we have, which is so important for the history of Khayal, because it really takes us into the question of what I said, the long history of Khayal and the short history of Khayal. Again, I'm surprised music historians don't talk about this. But the truth is that all that we know about our music is actually only 120 years old. Why am I saying this? Because that is when recording starts. We have absolutely no idea. And this is not just about Khayal, by the way. Any kind of music. We have no idea what our music sounded like or how it was performed before the advent of recording. Please keep this in mind. People don't seem to be flagging this at all. It's recording which first allows us to know what this music is. Remember that we don't have the notation system. Our traditions don't have it, right? So we just don't know. The music text that we have from the past, whatever text, Farsi text, Sanskrit text, they don't tell us how the music is performed. We don't know. We just don't know. So it is really actually when we do the history of Indian music or the history of Khayal, we have to contend musically only with the short history of Khayal. Of course, we can go back into the past and think about how Khayal was generated. But for that, we are dependent on textual sources, written sources. They are not musical sources. You want to know what the music is, it's only from 1899. This is fascinating. Now, the second thing, and this is very interesting, which is that because of this was something that was produced from the market, not everybody got recorded. So it's not, as I said, it's not a complete archive. Right? And even here, social and cultural norms played a huge part. This is so fascinating. The ustads, the Muslim ustads, for instance, refused to record. They did, of course, few of them did. Most of them refused to record. Why did they refuse to record? Because they said, why should we record? We have this knowledge. It has taken us 30 years, 40 years to learn this. We just make a 3.5-minute recording and everybody gets it. We are not parting with it so easily. So they stayed away from recording. Some of them did, of course, later on, they relented, they did, that happened. This, please mark this, this is very interesting. But on the other hand, thousands and thousands of people who sang khayal and allied forms of music of khayal called thumri and ghazal recorded. And who were these people? They were the Baijis. Why did the Baijis quickly take to recording? Because they were already in the market. That is what they did for a living. They sang in the pub, sang for a living. They did not have any qualms about recording. So the irony is that we have thousands of recordings of women khayal singers and thumri singers and ghazal singers. Compared to them, very few of the great Muslim ustads. What an irony, right? It's the women's voices which have survived. And we don't have that many of so-called the men's voices, right? It's very interesting. But when the histories are written, it is always the history of the male Gharana Ustad. I'm talking of the musical history, right? There is no place for the women there. But the evidence is all from the women singers. I find it, as I said, the irony of history. I may even go along and say, serve the old Ustads right? They didn't record, they don't have a place in history. The people who recorded, we know how they sang. And now I'm going to end with this, which is that, and this again, music historians haven't really explored in great detail. And it should, and there is a possibility to do this, that there is a possibility to write an alternative history of Khayal by using these recordings, using these recordings left by the women singers. That possibility, I think, really needs to be taken. I think I'll just finish here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Amar. Hi.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Partho Datta, for introducing us to a very difficult history and making it easy for us to understand aspects of it and the methodological problems that are associated with it, the short history, the long history of the Khayal. We'll request our moderator to please read out some of the observations, comments which we have been receiving, and questions, and perhaps we look forward to a wonderful discussion.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, sure.
Yeah.
There are two
Srijani,
questions till now. One from Priyanka Malik. How does urbanity influence classical music in terms of proliferation, particularly in the case of newly formed urban space Kolkata in 18th or 19th centuries? And sir, should I read?
No, just reread that question. I didn't get the first part of the question. I'm so sorry. How does?
Okay. How does urbanity influence classical music in terms of proliferation, particularly in the case of newly formed urban spaces like Kolkata in 18th, 19th centuries?
Okay. Yeah. So this is thank you for that question. So I have to tell you, of course, urbanity in the sense that it becomes a part of the ritual of living in cities where the upper classes take to some kinds of this kind of music, not but necessarily of Khayal, but what we know from Kolkata is that we have very early sort of illustrations of the first patrons of the Nach, so-called quote-unquote Nach girls, who obviously sang some kind of raga music, also thumris and probably also khayals. They were also trained in Dhrupad, incidentally. We have illustrations of British officials patronizing them, right? So that is how they find a home in Kolkata. Later on, we know that there develops in Bengal itself a very vigorous tradition of thinking and writing about music. And there is a musicological tradition. There are patrons, there are Bengali patrons who emerge. And the musicological tradition, and they start publishing books. So that is also part of the urbane tradition of patronizing music. Not necessarily Khayal in Kolkata, let me warn you. Some of Khayal was important, but as I told you, that the acceptance of Khayal there was uneven. And I'd like to just mention one very wonderful historian. His name is David Williams. I think he teaches in England somewhere. He's done a wonderful history of the rise of musicological traditions, that's writing about music in the early 19th century in Calcutta and in Bengal, which is linked to the proliferation of print cultures. So this question that you are asking is very beautifully, he has sort of shown how these two were linked, interlinked. So, so this question, to answer your question, urbanity, urban spaces, music is not only about patronage, but also the proliferation of print cultures. And later on, from early 20th century and later on, we also have another kind which I was hinting at, recordings. So recordings start circulating, right? So that's how we get urban cultures, which leads to the proliferation of this music.
Thank you, sir. And there's another question. Should I go ahead and read it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. This is from Saurav Sagar. What about the music Gharanas of the Gharanas of princely states, which were so much associated with music during high noon of the empire? For example, Patiala Gharana.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a thank you. So so what I hinted at right at the end of it, that if I couldn't really talk about all the traditions of writing the history of or understanding the history of Khayal. One way to understand the history of Khayal is to study the history of the Gharanas, because the Gharanas themselves have an identity, and they have produced a kind of history, right? They have produced a kind of history of themselves. So the first thing that we have to flag is that all these Gharanas are very recent. Although the mythic history says that they are very ancient or they have roots in medieval India. Actually, there is no proof to show it really, right? So this is a reorganization of the oral tradition in very interesting ways, which happens between the late 19th century and the 1940s or so, right? The Gharana system comes into being. But we do know, and I didn't have time to go into it, I just hinted at this, that the patronage for particularly the Muslim ustads came from the princes. And a range of princes, big princes and sometimes very small princes, landlords. And what I argue, and what many other historians have also hinted at it, that although in politically these princes they had been defanged, but they in fact compensated for it culturally. So they became very important cultural patrons. And if we are going to study the history of Khayal, the importance of princely patronage is enormous, We cannot delink these two, right? All the Muslim ustads, including some of their disciples, Hindu disciples, found patronage and help from these courts. So the history of Khayal is absolutely integrally tied to this. About the Patiala Gharana, obviously it is a kind of tribute to the Patiala court, but also Kapurthala was very important. Let me tell you, as a patron of music. But other kinds of patrons also started emerging. If you're really talking about Punjab, let me tell you one of the very early important, it was a new activity that started, was the famous Harballa festival in Jalandhar, which is supposed to have started in the 1870s, 80s. That was also a kind of patronage, right? You invited people to come and sing in a public platform. So it's all linked together. The Lahore was a very important center. It had linked to the courts, to all the courts, to Jammu, to Patiala, to Delhi, to Jalandhar. That cultural zone was very, very important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bharti Jagannathan wants to.
Yeah, there was a question from
Bharati.
Bharti Jagannathan. Bharti?
Yeah, may I? Thank you, Partho. Thank you, Amar. Thank you,
Bharti.
Partho, for this fascinating lecture. Partho, there are a couple of questions that I have, and they come from ignorance rather than anything else. Now, I obviously listen to, and when I listen, I can clearly differentiate between Khayal and Drupad. I don't know anything technically, but I definitely know what is Khayal and what is Drupad. Now, you said something very interesting, which is that when it went to Calcutta, they did not, Rabindranath Tagore himself did not take to Khayal very much. And you also mentioned Hadu Khan, who goes to Calcutta and he sings there and people didn't enjoy it. And then he was advised to sing Drupad and they were able to appreciate it better. Now, a couple of things which I keep getting confused about also. I believe that, which I cannot, I mean, when I listen, I cannot make out that Drupad is always in Chautal, whereas Khayal is in Teen Tal and Ek Tal and all of various other kind of, Kahrwa Tal, whatever. You can have lots of tals for Khayal. But Drupad is always in Chautal. Now,
not always
I have
in Chautal, but similar tals. Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah.
Okay,
fine.
I don't know anything about it because I cannot make out any tal. मुझे कभी नहीं पता चलता है कौन सा क्या ताल है. I have no clue at all. Now I want to know, when he's asked to sing in Drupad, is it what he's doing is, and I'm going to take, I mean, please forgive my very ignorant kind of a question, but I'm going to frame it the way I can. Now, for example, T.M. Krishna is, eschewing a lot of the old lyrics, and he's taking Perumal Murugan's lyrics, for example, which is very modern lyrics. Also, he's setting different kinds of, revolutionary poetry to the traditional ragas, and he's singing them in a proper, what might be called, what has been established over the last 70, 80, 90 years, the Carnatic style, but he's singing very different lyrics. Now, when you are saying that Hadu Khan was advised to sing Drupad in Calcutta and he got better reception, is it that he is, it is the lyrics that he is adopting? Because the lyrics also, from the little I know, the Drupad lyrics are hardly ever sung in Khayal, and Khayal lyrics are never sung in Drupad, from what little I know. Now, I want to know what you meant by Hadu Khan ka his singing there, or Rabindranath Tagore saying that, Khayal doesn't really work for me. He takes a bit to Drupad and then he goes on a different journey. I want to understand that a little better. And forgive me for my very, very...
No. I think there's nothing. I think you've got your sense of Drupad and Khayal very well. The only way to make the difference is by listening. Musicologists can say this, ye tha, wo tha. That's frankly, that is not that important. I mean, that's only important for musicology. So only by listening, you can immediately tell what's Drupad and what is Khayal. Right?
Yeah, sure.
Let me tell you the first difference. Which you have noticed that Drupad is always played with a pakhavaj, right? The pakhavaj itself has a repertoire of certain tals. It can be sung only along that. It's like, so it sets the, if you like, the momentum and the rhythm of that singing. Khayal is sung with a tabla. The tabla has a momentum and a rhythm of its own. It's not to say one is better than the other. I'm not making that kind of comparison at all. So the idiom of Khayal is completely different. And you are absolutely right. By listening, you can immediately tell this is Khayal and this. Nobody, you don't need to know the musicology of. So first of all, Drupad will never be sung with a tabla, right? Because that percussion instrument produces a certain rhythmic momentum, which does not, the genre of that music is fitted to that kind of rhythmic momentum. So Khayal has something to do with tabla or that kind of percussive instrument. Drupad will always be with pakhavaj, right? That's the first thing. Secondly, the history of relationship So let me tell you that Haddu Khan's story, which is a reported story. It's there actually in a music history book. Haddu Khan didn't sing Dhrupad. He was told, ki, now you sing like Dhrupad, because people are not appreciating this new thing called Khayal, right, which you are singing. Now, what was this new thing? I'm glad you asked this question. The thing that differentiates musically Dhrupad from Khayal is the Tan. The Khayal has Tans. Tans are rapid melodic patterns. Rapid melodic patterns. Dhrupads never have, right? So that is their identity, right? So the Tan is something. I mean, the Khayal has many other things also which are different from Dhrupad, but this is the difference. This is the difference. Dhrupadiyas never sing Tans, right? Now, the interesting thing is, why did Calcuttans not like it, and why did Tagore not like it, or people in Bengal didn't like it? Because the Dhrupad tradition was entrenched there. There's a reason. Because Tans are fast-moving melodic patterns, so they are seen as too ornamental. In fact, this is exactly the criticism of Khayal by Dhrupad in the 19th and early 20th century, that this genre of music is just too ornamental. It does not have the grandeur of Dhrupad, which is sung relatively in slow tempo, right? It does not have the kind of alap which you begin with, the rag, right? It straight away begins with a song and then rapidly moves into melodic patterns. So said, what is this kind of music? It's always flitting all the time. It's so ornamental. It can't stay steady on its feet. This is not the kind of music we want to listen to. This is what they thought Khayal was, right? So there were lots of musical cultural zones which clung on to Dhrupad, but finally, even I have to say that they had to give way, right? Khayal did become popular in Bengal, but much later. One reason why, although frankly, I don't know whether we can really say this, that Bengal has produced relatively fewer Khayal vocalists than say Maharashtra and Karnataka, because the acceptance of Khayal vocalism happened much later, much later. The last point I wanted to ask, the relationship musically now, between Dhrupad and Khayal is very interesting. Khayal borrows and kept on borrowing from Dhrupad all the time, right? Including the lyrics. So right up till the 1940s, 50s, 40s, to give you an example, you can actually see it in some little bit of training of music, and you can see that the lyrics of the Khayal lyrics are actually have been taken off from a Dhrupad composition, but the style of singing has been slightly changed. The rag is maintained, but you add ornamentations like tan and so on. So these borrowings kept on happening. Khayal kept on drawing on the rich bank of compositions which the medieval genre of Dhrupad provided. I just want to make one comment, because I didn't have time to do it. This is one reason why we can't do. That's what I was hinting at right at the end of my first part of my presentation. We can't do evolutionary histories of music. Please understand, it's not that Khayal became dominant because it was a more superior genre that evolved into something more superior than an earlier genre called Dhrupad, right? Dhrupad as music itself, rhythmically, melodically, lyrically, is as rich as Khayal subsequently began. And there was a lot of borrowings between, and Khayal actually took a lot from Dhrupad itself. So the question really is not, usually music historians, and I find it really, a problematic way to understand it. Ki Khayal is Khayal because Khayal means imagination. So it is much more imaginative than Dhrupad, right? But actually this is not true at all. It is not true at all musically, right? Why Khayal then becomes predominant, we have to look for other reasons. That is what I was trying to really address in my paper today.
I think we have a comment and then there are two questions. Srijani?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
This question is from Kajri Rai Mahase. She's asking.
No, I think first read out the comment. There's a comment here.
So,
Shall I read it out?
yes, sir, I've got it. The contribution of music in the 1920s was an important time. Comment by Mahipal Barchul Kutyal from Facebook. Is this the comment you're talking about, sir? Okay.
And then there are two questions. There are two questions after that.
Okay. I'll read them out. From Kajri, the question is how important the lyrics were to the Gharanas in the period before the 19th century and whether any particular changes have been traced in the more recent history studied through the recordings from what is found in the older textual sources.
Okay. So let me answer this to Nanu. So let me tell you that one way of understanding Khayal, what we know, what we think of as Khayal is the repertoire that people sing, right? That is by repertoire meaning that what we call the bandish, which is a short composition which people sing. Now, these are traditional compositions and we know that there is a common repertoire which all Khayal singers sing, right? Where this repertoire has come from is difficult to trace. It's very difficult to trace. Some can be traced, of course, because these are traditional compositions. So first point, that one way to identify Khayal is also by its compositions, in the sense that the compositions which are sung. All Gharanas, across Gharanas, some compositions are sung. They're common. So it's the common legacy, if you like. But it's a long tradition, long oral tradition. Where it has come from, as I say, it's difficult. Why do I say this? Very interesting. So, of course, there are compositions with names in them, right? So I remember I said that there is some consensus that Khayal came into its own, not that it was first that the history of Khayal begins in the 18th century, but it came into its own in the 18th century. And Khayal's, why do we say this? 18th century, two court musicians in Muhammad Shah Rangila's court, Sadarang and Adarang's compositions, because their names have Sadarang and Adarang in it, are still sung today. All Khayal singers sing it. You listen to any recording by Jasraj, Bhimsen Joshi, Rashid Khan, Kishori Amonkar, just name it, Padma Talwalkar, Ashwini Bide Deshpande, everybody sings them, right? So Adarang, Sadarang compositions form a body of. But let me tell you, there's no time to go into this. These are extremely problematic things we can only say attributed to Sadarang Adarang, because we know that these compositions, while they were sung, must have been written by Sadarang Adarang. There's no notation, by the way. We only have the lyrics. They're committed to print much later on. In the case of Sadarang Adarang, only in the late 19th century, I think, in a volume called Sangeet Kalpatru. I have this information from Catherine Schofield. I'd like to mention here that one of the finest works on the long history of Khayal, I repeat, the long history of Khayal, has been done by Catherine Schofield. She has published a dozen essays which are easily available on academic.edu, and I'm told that her book is going to be out any day on Khayal history, and when it comes, I'll tell you, it'll change the landscape of Khayal history, right? So do look for, if you're really interested, she looks at this in great detail. Let me give you one last example about how the problems that historians face. Two examples that we give you. I don't want to get into it. One is Amir Khusro. There is no evidence. We say there is Amir Khusro wrote this, Amir Khusro wrote that. We only have it from the oral tradition. no evidence to in Amir Khusro's writings itself, which some of which are extant, that he wrote them. In fact, Catherine Schofield says the first connection between Amir Khusro and Khayal was only made in the 17th century in some Farsi text. Right? Let me give you another example. Tansen. You'll be surprised, some of his lyrics attributed to Tansen were only committed to print in the late 19th, early 20th century. That late, right? So, so again, I mean, take the oral tradition. It says this is Tansen. If you go by quote unquote strict historical evidence, it's really a problematic thing. I hope I've answered some of these questions.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, I'm just going to read a lot more. And thank you. Can I just ask a quick question, one more? Is it okay, Amar sir?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, sir, I mean, I don't know. Right now, I have 2-3 more questions in my head. But when you were answering Bharti ma'am's question, and you mentioned the difference between Drupad and Khayal, to be very honest, I learned something new. And I was thinking about how Rabindranath Tagore's music, he is also very much, I mean, his songs are divided into different tals. So he has borrowed heavily from Khayal and not Drupad then. So, you know, his whole claim, isn't it a bit just words?
I'm actually making slightly, okay, let me make it clear. I didn't have the time to this thing. No, he drew on raga music. And it is true that some of his compositions were ode to Khayal. There is no, but not that much. You look at books on Rabindranath Tagore, Tagore's music and so on and so forth. What I was trying to trace was how Khayal proliferates and starts dominating, right? In the case of Maharashtra, what happens, Khayal compositions, these bandishes, the musical compositions are adopted lock, stock and barrel and adopted into theater music, and it starts circulating. So Khayal is of course there, but it also starts circulating in another form, right? In the case, if you look at, so we have the Sangeet Natak tradition, which is full of Khayal bandishes. Of course, the lyrics are all Marathi, but they're full of Khayal bandishes. And the tradition continues right up till the 1950s and 40s and 50s, when the first early pioneers of Hindi film music, Anil Biswas, Shankar Jaikishan, this also do Naushad, lock, stock and barrel, take Khayal bandishes and make them into Hindi songs. Of course, the lyrics are changed. Sometimes the lyrics are also not changed, by the way. So that happens, right? So that's one tradition. So Khayal really, everybody gets to listen to Khayal. If you listen to Tagore's, he wrote 2,000 songs. Tagore is a good example because there's a range of music available there. There are very few songs which you can directly identify with well-known Khayal compositions. A few you can. So clearly he did not take quite like that. I mean, he was very innovative. He did all kinds of things, made drugs. So that's what I was saying. So the influence was much less. This is my reading of it. This is my reading.
No, I have much more to listen to than to read. Thank you so much.
Sir, Seema Baba ma'am, Professor Seema Baba wants to know the role of music festivals such as Sham Chaurasi and the ascendancy of Khayal. So
Sham Chaurasi is a Gharana, right? Yes. What you want to know about music festivals? Very interesting question. Thank you. So Khayal is very closely connected to what we call modernity through three things. One is that it is connected to technology, which I was telling you about, recording. It is connected to print cultures, very, very important, because Khayal and all other kinds of music also circulate through, later it happens with notation systems. It's written about in journals and so on and so forth. And lastly, Khayal is absolutely crucial to the public sphere. That is, it is performed publicly, right? Music is performed. Remember that this kind of music, including Khayal, was usually performed in salons, right? In courts, in salons, or in the dargah, or in matha, but these were closed spaces. But this publicness, by the way, is very new. I'm so glad you asked this question. So the music festival that we associate Khayal with, very recently we had music in the park, Nehru Park. Most of the singers, by the way, sang Khayal. I don't know whether you noticed this. But music in the park, Khayal was never sung like this into such a large audience. And this history is also very new, only from the 1940s. You'll be surprised. Otherwise, this music was always heard in small spaces. It's very interesting. I'll give you one iconic example. The famous music festival which happened in Bombay in 1944. This is much written about. It was called the Vikramaditya Music Conference. 1944, as late as that. And there, all the great singers of that time congregated and sang. There was no recordings made, although recording technology was available, but there's a lot of written material on it. So just telling you that even in Calcutta, another very important place for music patronage and publicness of music, this kind of music festival only starts from the very late 30s, early 40s. So it's a very, very new thing.
So there's a question from Arijit Chatterjee. I wonder how the British gaze upon the tradition of Khayal vis-a-vis the European styles of music were, since you were mentioning, if I heard it correctly, as they were connoisseurs too. Was it just an Orientalist view as it had been with other forms of art, or was it something different?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that question. So we have some evidence, you're absolutely right, of early, there's a wonderful book by Jerry Farrell called Indian Music and the West. Do have a look at it, Arijit. There's a chapter there which actually shows that there was some very early patronage by British East India Company officials, very much in the mode of the William Dalrymple kind of writing, which is that these people were genuinely, that phase, very early phase of colonialism, genuinely felt interested in Indian culture, took to Indian cultural norms, started wearing Indian clothes, married Indian women, patronized Indian music, and so on and so forth. And there was some notations made of Indian music in the 18th century, but it was short-lived. It soon disappeared. And the proof I can give you is that when the first recording company, what was called the Gramophone and Typewriter Company of came to Calcutta to record, this is 1899, 1900, and the person, and this was a foreign company, and the recording engineer was an American. He went around asking, and since he was white and American, he went around asking Europeans, ki bhai main kya record karu? What should I record? What do you think is interesting to record in? And the Europeans could tell him nothing about Indian music. So there was they had no interest. Partly the reason, and this is what I was hinting at in the talk, that there is this myth that Indian music and Khayal was uninfluenced by outside outsiders, which includes, of course, the British, right? That somehow it managed to escape colonialism, right? But if we look at it that way, that would be a very simplistic way to do it. As I said, that to understand the how Khayal got influenced or Indian musics got influenced, we will have to see the other kinds of influences that come into music. So, for instance, the normative standards that are set by recording, which is modern technology, which comes, that's also, we have to understand that. You have to understand how the public sphere develops. You have to understand how print cultures develop, right? Which is the impact of colonialism, right? It's colonialism provides the context in which all this happens. And our music hasn't escaped that, right? So music is very influenced by, it's the political and social circumstance.
Thank you, sir. So,
yeah, I don't think. We'll ask the participants in case there are still some questions. Razi, Razi, please.
This is such an interesting discussion, Partho. Arijit was also saying, thank you for such an enriching talk, sir. So,
Yes,
enriching
thank
talk.
you.
So that
Thank
was
you. Thank you,
that
Rajiv.
first
Yeah.
line was not read out to you. So this was very interesting. I was just thinking of going back to Kajri's first question and your response to it with regard to the older textual tradition. And this reference to this fascinating work by Catherine Schofield,
Yes, yes.
especially that classic essay on did Aurangzeb ban music?
Band music. Yes, I know.
So my my response to your presentation is a bit emotional because there is Aurangzeb, there is also Amir Khusro.
Yes, I know.
Because you see, and the text that she was referring to is a very, very interesting 1666 text, which is compiled by a person who was in the service of Aurangzeb. But given the kind of guidance and invocation to Islamic orthodoxy that Aurangzeb was, resorting to, that he left, his darbar and went to Sirhind, where he then dedicated himself to reading texts.
Okay.
So then Mansi Tomar wrote in the 15th, early 16th century, this text called Man Kotuhal, which he translated into Persian. And then he also wrote his own work called Rag Darpan. So this
that's right.
Tarjuma Man Kotuhal and Rag Darpan were put together by him. It's a huge thing, 1660s. And in that, there are many things, and the thing which is very important for our conversation is with regard to different kinds of forms of styles of songs, sarod. And then he is talking about Bengal style, Deccan style, and then Delhi style. And now about Delhi style, what he's saying? He's saying Khayalu Tarana.
Okay.
All. And then quite a few other forms which are such as Naksh Nigar, See, there is a form called Tilallana, Suhla. And then there are Qawwals who sang these already in the time of Nizamuddin Aulia, in his Mahafil-e-Sama. Okay. And the interesting thing, as Catherine has also pointed out, that these styles are already being attributed to Amir Khusro. So this is a Delhi style, and the term that is used in Persian, it is ravish,
Ravish, yes.
Ravish hai, ये दिल्ली की रविश है और खुसरो की रविश है. And the interesting part is that this is being written in Aurangzeb outside of his court, because Aurangzeb is told by the ulama, Hanafi ulama, who are writing his Fatawai, Alamgiri, etc., that listen, you can listen to music minus pakhavach. Instrument pakhavach. So we are getting into the Hindu, part. Okay. So instruments as such are not acceptable because sounds, awaz, are important in themselves. And the kind of awaz in khayal, all, tarana are possible. The way the best of the qawwals were, able to bring out, that was enough. Why do you need pakhavach? Then Aurangzeb then began to listen to all this. He was not impressed. So he said, ban it, ban it. Okay. Minus pakhavach, khayal is not going to work for him. Okay. And then you are right, we are getting into Hindu-Muslim business now. No, in terms of identification of certain forms which are acceptable, say in the Sufi fraternity now, which were now being questioned, whereas previously not, because when it came to instruments also, there was a continuous refrain that instruments, mazamir, are not required. Whereas Nizamuddin Aulia is saying, well, okay, we don't need mazamir. And yet the best of the instruments are already in the 14th century are being attributed to Amir Khusro in terms of innovations, etc. So this is a long history. And then the other thing that she has also pointed out, that the best of the texts on musicology are actually written in the latter half of the 17th century when Aurangzeb is ruling.
Yes, exactly.
Tuhfatul Hind, there's other texts, Tuhfatul Hind. Then there is a Sanskrit text simultaneously translated Bhakha, brush text, translated simultaneously in Persian, and those texts are available to us. So
Yeah.
now your concern is very important. What happened to these older traditions in later times, and how, by 20th century, we are into a different proposition altogether with all the recordings, etc. coming up, and then a certain degree of communalization also
Oh yes, definitely.
coming in. But best of the musicians and best of the poets, singers are above communalism always, isn't it? And above nationalist kind of narrow nationalist kind of fervors.
Absolutely. In fact, this thing. Thank you, Razi. In fact, I did not stray into the pre-modern area because I realized that without knowing the Farsi text, how can you actually do it? And what you said, I would like to talk about this with you. But the thing is this, that the oral traditions on this is still very strong. So the Delhi Gharana will say कि हम खुसरवी गाते हैं. They actually think the compositions of Khusro. For the historian, the problem is Khusro, some of his material exists, but those elements which they sing is not there. So we just don't know. That is the only problem. But there's no reason to disbelieve the long oral tradition. What we can say definitely for the history of Khayal is that this strong connection to Amir Khusro and Nizamuddin Auliya, you'll be surprised in Khayal compositions, particularly Rag Basant, Rag Purvi, Rag, these two Rags, Rag Bahar, composition after composition is celebrating Nizamuddin Auliya. Everybody sings it, even now. It doesn't matter who, it's kind of. So what is very clear for the historian, the thing is this, very clear that Khayal tradition, the history of Khayal certainly owes a lot to the history of the musical traditions of the Dargah. That is absolutely clear. What is not clear for the historian so much is whether this was Amir Khusro. That is the thing. That's a much more complex thing, but that's not to dismiss that, this is not Amir Khusro or whatever, but it's just that, how should I put it? Historians work with quote unquote empiricist traditions. So they say, yeah, nahi milta hai evidence, to hum kaise bol sakte hain, that kind of thing. But the oral tradition is very, very strong. But the other thing I always find very interesting, which is that of all things, Bhatkhande and others had to adopted Khayal, which was the hybrid tradition. They could have chosen Dhrupad, which was quote unquote more Hindu. No, they didn't take it. They could have chosen Carnatic music, which was supposedly untainted from both Muslim rule and colonial rule. Right? They did not choose that. They fix on Khayal because they are mesmerized by the range of the bank of music of Khayal. And Bhatkhande, so what I'm saying is that he ends up qualifying his own. So this for me, I find it so interesting. How did Hindustani music become Hindustani? According to, the problem with historians is that we start looking at, since we pitch it at Hindu Muslim, then it's so easy to read a kind of Hinduization. But the fact is, it's constantly being qualified, including by the people who want to do quote unquote Hindu music. So I would say Hindu histories of Hindu music produced Hindustani music. That's how I would put it. That is so fascinating, right?
Yeah. In fact, in this context and the reference that Razi was making to the attempt to dissociate Pakhavaj from Drupad, I thought, it is significant that you should have, the point that you made about self-doubt, khayal, this sort of self-doubt about self, and the way in which, this is something that really is the product not of the tradition itself, but the attempt to construct an identity for it. So constructing an identity for it is actually what becomes a problem. And but I'll go back to what Bharati was discussing with you. Somehow I still find it difficult to figure out you referred to how the reception of Khayal in Bengal wasn't too happy. And of course, given time, it has acquired, of course, there's been a longer sort of trajectory to that. But I really, am not sure how you explain. I mean, I really am not sure how one can explain Rabindranath Tagore's response to it, or of the audience that you made a reference to, that you sing it in the Drupad style and they're not exposed to this genre. I mean, this would suggest a kind of lack of openness, which perhaps seems very specific to Bengal, which I think needs to be explained, not just with Rabindranath Tagore's response to it, and in that context, the other way around, Bhatkande not responding, in a very sort of way to Carnatic music.
Yes, I know that is very I know.
So I think there are these problems which one perhaps needs to, and perhaps also putting off others from being open to that tradition.
So, Amar, I have to tell you this. You'll be so interesting. I won't put it as openness. What I was trying to, and I didn't have the time to tell you. Any area, any cultural zone, whether Bengal or Maharashtra or wherever, they have very rich traditions of music. So, there was Bengal had. So we know Bengal had the Kirtan tradition. It had the Tappa tradition, which is Khayal-like thing, was very strong there. And it's just that the new kid in the block, which was Khayal in Bengal, they just didn't take to it because they said, ye kya hai? By the way, the reception of Khayal, historically, anecdotally, let me tell you, when Adarang and Sadarang, the so-called, these are anecdotal stories, you have no proof for it. Oral story. Adarang and Sadarang supposed to have created Khayal. They only taught it to their, can you believe it, only to their women disciples, supposedly, because they saw it as a low form of music. Which means for them, Drupad was still the most important form of raga music. So what is interesting is how this genre then not only gains respectability, but this is what I was trying to understand, and also gains dominance. Why does it happen? In Bengal, I have to tell you this, in the 1930s, the person who starts adopting, and this is fascinating, Khayal bandishes into Bengali songs is another very, very great man, Qazi Nazrul Islam. He travels to Lahore, he travels to Mesopotamia, he's fought in the First World War, he's in the army, he listens to this music, he wants to learn something, he comes back, he starts composing, he's also a composer like Tagore, writes lyrics, and so Khayal starts getting recorded in Bengali. Of course, other things are also available, but that's one way in which it starts, gets acceptance. But it happens much later. Tagore is not impressed at all. I mean, he listens to it, but I mean, kind of. He says, "Mujhe kya karna hai is gaane ko lekar? Main apna gana banaunga." That's what he said actually. He said, "Agar main tradition ko hi sunta rahun," which is what he was saying. It's a very important point. He says, "If all I did was bow to the tradition, then I will have nothing to say. Why should I listen to this? I'll make my own music."
Yeah.
Right? So that's the thing.
There's one sort of important issue which you flagged at the beginning of your talk when you talked about method.
Yeah.
And you saying, talking about the different perspectives from which it's possible to approach history of music, and you referred to sound studies.
Yes.
Now, interestingly, we had Aparna give a talk a few weeks back, and
Right,
we
yeah.
were talking about sound studies and how Europeans in Tamil Nadu responded to
Sounds, yeah.
to sound, to temple music, and and the other way around. How local residents, they responded to music that sounds which are unfamiliar. And then we sort of got down to discussing also the question of this space, particularly the church as a space, and the sermon, and how the Reformation changed the positioning of the person who was delivering the sermon, so that it could be better audible to the audience. And that's where to a question of method, that we need a better understanding of architecture to have some understanding of
the sound.
Sound. Now, you referred in that context, you're saying that this is something that one can pursue only if you are well informed.
Yes, I know.
Now, that's a difficult thing to do. For someone who really has, who's just familiar with a little bit of classical music, to acquire that training requires a lifetime. And I was just sort of thinking that this, I understand the importance of that, but they must be made, easier ways of going about it. I don't mean less rigorous. By easier, I mean that you would.
So, Amar, there is no easy answer to this. The fact is that in the Euro-American system, to which we always look to, whether we have to acknowledge it, we are looking to the Euro-American traditions. The fact is that these are disciplines well entrenched in the academic system. You train in ethnomusicology or musicology or sound studies or whatever, in Farsi or whatever. You really train first. If you go to the American system, they will make you learn Farsi for 6, 7, 8 years. Then only you will be allowed to do a PhD in medieval India. I say bata raha hu, just to give you an example. That is the rigor that is there. Yes, there is no easy way, but we can use some of their insights. Let me tell you about sound studies. Very interesting. This has also come out partly from post-colonial, post-modern critiques of what we call meta-narratives. And their argument is that West enlightenment, we know this is there in all textbooks, which is that the organization of society and knowledge systems in the Western, post-enlightenment in the Western world is through the eye. It's the, Foucault has written about it, the ocular centric. It's the eye which actually hierarchizes and decides. They are saying no. Who said this? This is one narrative in the way we have organized the world, or we perceive the world, right? But we also can. So now, sound is also is the way in which we can look. So that is the approach of sound studies. And then they say that we live in sounding environments, right? Just as we in social political contexts, we live in sounding, and that determines human relationships. We have to try understand that. We have to really try to understand. So this very sophisticated work. Let me tell you though, a great deal of the sound studies people actually come from with some training, lots of training in musicology and ethnomusicology.
Yeah.
That is their strength also. It's not as if कि चलेगा ऐसे ही और sound studies करने लगे. ऐसा नहीं है. It has evolved out of that discipline, and I'm sure it'll happen here also. We'll have students who.
No, I think this is important because young researchers starting off, they need also to understand what they have to be equipped with.
Yeah. Absolutely.
When they set out, and these are disciplines which are sort of, they're complex. They're drawn insights of several disciplines. So
yeah. So I just one very short thing, because Razi was talking. I just wanted to tell you that ethnomusicology, for instance, its history. In fact, I would the history of these disciplines are so fascinating in themselves. I mean, you can talk about it. Ethnomusicology, as you know, it comes out of colonialism. It's really studying the history, the music of the dominated, right? That is, but see, it's changed now. That thing is
unfamiliar.
The ethnomusicologists now, what has come out of ethnomusicology, they've really questioned their own tradition, which is they've really questioned what is music, right? So we think music is melodic forms primarily or rhythmic, but is it so? So for instance, Razi was talking about this. I just have to tell you, in Islam, for instance, if you hear the call to prayer, it sounds very musical, but it may not be seen by music in certain Islamic, it not be seen as music in certain Islamic cultures. It is just seen as calling, as chanting the name of God or something, right? Similarly, so it depends upon how you define music. That can only happen when you do field work. Cultures determine the nature of music and also how you define music. So that's what I said, that remember I was hinting at this, that when you do the history of music, it's not another subject for which histories have to be written. You also have to study the categories through which this is understood. So for instance, ethnomusicologists will tell you there is no term for musician in many African societies, because their argument is कि musician क्या होता है? Everybody sings and dances. ये जो कैटेगरी हमने बनाया कि म्यूजिशियन होगा, he is a musician, I am not. This is a category through which we are working, right? So these are also, it's fascinating, absolutely. So there is no word for musician apparently in parts of North Africa. This comes from ethnomusicology. So we really, so these disciplines really need to have really taught us a lot. I was lamenting in some senses that we plug into so many things into the Euro-American world, but we don't seem to plug into ethnomusicology or musicology or sound studies. I think if you're going to do the history of music, we will have to engage with them. That's what I was saying.
Right. Thank you for those thoughts, those reflections. Srijani will be winding up. Yeah.
So there's a comment from Parul ma'am, Professor Parul Pandya. What a wonderful exposition of the history and intricacies of Khayal rendition. Thank you, Professor Partho Datta. So yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Dhar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the very engaging talk. Thanks to all who joined us today. And with this lecture today, we conclude our series of talks this semester. We express our gratitude to all the speakers we have had, to our audience on Zoom as well as on Facebook. And we especially thank our professors, Raziuddin sir, Amar sir, Seema Baba ma'am, Parul ma'am, Shalin sir, and other professors who have been there with us, chairing the talks or helping us conduct the webinars. So yes, and we'll be back with a new series of presentations from July this year. So stay tuned, and till then, stay safe, take care. Thank you.
Okay, thank you also. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this interacting with everybody. It was really a privilege to talk.
What a wonderful talk.
Yeah.
What a wonderful way to conclude this series. This has really been so sort of this has been I mean we're having these series online, and hopefully now we'll Razi, the next round.
Yes, this Khayal is about thought patterns. So thought patterns regarding ultimate reality. So,
I know.
so where we are going to go, you have taken it to a nehaj from where we can only go up rather than fall. So hopefully, end of July, we'll consult you and Amar sir also for a new series of some very interesting lectures, maybe some other speakers speaking on these art forms.
And we hope that Professor Partho Datta will be willing to spare time for the physical online series as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm always delighted to come to Delhi University. I'll be only too happy. Thank you, Amar. Thank you, Razi, and everybody. Sort of. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. See you. Bye.
Bye.